The rain had been falling since noon, the kind that soaks through everything and leaves a person feeling heavier than they actually are. Daniel Hartwell pressed his palm flat against the restaurant window and watched the street outside blur into smears of headlight and puddle. Behind him, the birthday cake sat untouched white frosting, 2 candles, one for each decade of a life he barely recognized anymore. He had bought it himself from the grocery store 3 blocks over, carried it under his jacket through the rain, and now it looked slightly lopsided from where he had held it too tightly on the walk. He was 32 years old tonight. The restaurant was called Crestmore, and it was the kind of place that had cloth napkins folded into swans and a wine list the size of a paperback novel. Daniel had never eaten here before. He had chosen it precisely because he had never eaten here before, because some small, foolish part of him had decided that 32 deserved something different, something that didn't smell like the break room at Caldwell Construction, where he spent 10 hours a day hauling equipment and reading blueprints for other men to execute. He was a foreman now, which meant he was paid slightly more than the men he supervised, and was blamed slightly more quickly when anything went wrong. He was good at the work. He had learned to be good at it because goodness at things is the only reliable currency available to people who have had everything else taken from them. He had worn his good jacket. It was not actually a good jacket. It was simply the least worn of the 3 he owned. A dark navy wool blend he had bought at a consignment shop 2 winters ago. The rain had found its way through the shoulders almost immediately. The hostess had seated him at a small table near the kitchen, not the worst table in the room, but close. He had smiled at her anyway. She had not smiled back, but she had handed him a menu with the brisk efficiency of someone who had already made an assessment and moved on. He was accustomed to that particular species of invisibility. 10 years of being quietly removed from the rooms that once wanted you develops a certain tolerance for being overlooked. Now a waiter drifted past without stopping, and Daniel watched a couple 3 tables over receive their entrees with a kind of easy ceremony that made him feel like a trespasser. The woman laughed at something. Her laugh was bright and uncomplicated. The man refilled her water glass without being asked. Daniel turned back to his window. 32. He tested the number in his mind the way a person tests a bruise, not to heal it, just to know it's still there. He had a daughter he hadn't seen in 3 days because his shift schedule had shifted again. And his ex-wife, not the woman he was thinking about tonight, but the woman who had come after, the brief and collision-prone marriage that had produced nothing but legal fees and mutual exhaustion, had taken Lily to her mother's house in Harrisburg. He would see Lily on Sunday. He held on to Sunday the way sailors hold on to maps. But tonight, the cake. Tonight, the fancy restaurant. Tonight, some gesture toward himself that he couldn't quite articulate. He was studying the menu with the careful attention of a man calculating, when he became aware that he was being watched. She was sitting 3 tables away, beside a woman whose back was to him, a woman in a pale gray coat who was speaking in a low voice on a phone. The girl was perhaps 8 years old, with dark brown hair pulled back in a messy half-braid, and the kind of serious brown eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. She was holding a small stuffed bear against her chest, and she was staring at Daniel with an intensity that made him shift in his chair. He gave her a small smile. The apologetic, non-threatening kind that adults give children in public places. She didn't smile back. She just kept looking at him, and something in that look made the noise of the restaurant fall slightly away, as if the room had turned down its own volume. Daniel looked back at his menu, looked up again. She was still watching. The woman on the phone, her mother, presumably had turned slightly, still talking, one hand gesturing as she spoke. The girl set her stuffed bear carefully on the table. She slid off her chair. She walked toward him with the deliberate steadiness of a child who has decided something and will not be talked out of it. She stopped at the edge of his table. "Are you Daniel?" she asked. He set the menu down. "I am," he said. She studied his face for a moment, comparing it to something internal, some image she had been given or constructed. Then she leaned forward slightly, as if what she was about to say required proximity to be true. "My mom still cries over you," she whispered. "Every night." The room went completely quiet, though of course it hadn't. The couple laughed again. The kitchen rattled. Rain tapped the windows. But Daniel Hartwell sat very still at his small table with his lopsided birthday cake and felt the past 10 years shift beneath him like a floor that had always been hollow. Herr Name was Sophie. She told him this with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who had been taught that names are the first and most important thing you offer a stranger. She also told him that she was 8 3/4, that the bear's name was Admiral, and that her mom had said they were meeting a business contact for dinner, which Sophie had understood to mean someone boring, but had come anyway because the restaurant had a dessert menu with 4 kinds of chocolate cake. Daniel sat very still through all of this, afraid that if he moved, the moment would end. "What's your mom's name?" he asked. Though some part of him, a deep, sealed-off part that had survived on silence and endurance for a decade, already knew. "Olivia," Sophie said. "Olivia Marsh." Marsh. Her father's name. She hadn't married then, hadn't taken someone else's name. He looked past Sophie toward the woman in the gray coat, who was still on the phone, turned away, one hand pressed to the back of her neck the way she always used to hold herself when a conversation was going longer than she wanted it to. Daniel's chest did something it hadn't done in years. "How did you know my name?" he asked Sophie. The girl considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "There's a photo," she said. "In Mom's work bag. Not the regular bag, the old one she keeps on the high shelf. I found it when I was looking for scissors." She paused. "You have different hair now." He almost laughed. He had different everything now. 10 years ago, Daniel Hartwell had been a systems architect at Meridian Technologies, not a famous company, not a household name, but a firm that worked on sensitive data infrastructure for mid-size financial institutions, and which paid its best engineers very well. He had been 22, and he had been brilliant at things that are difficult to explain at parties. He had also been in love with Olivia Marsh in the consuming, architecture-rearranging way that only happens when you are young enough to not yet know how rare it is. They had been together for 11 months when her father, Gregory Marsh, the company's founder and majority shareholder, had called Daniel into his office and presented him with a folder. Inside the folder was evidence, or what looked like evidence. Security logs, access timestamps, flagged data transfers, all pointing to Daniel as the source of a leak that had cost a client firm $400,000 and compromised their transaction records for a fiscal quarter. Daniel had sat in the leather chair across from Gregory Marsh's enormous desk and turned the pages with the slow disbelief of someone reading a story about themselves that they have never lived. Every date was right. Every technical detail was right. The signature on the authorization logs looked exactly like his own, because someone had studied it long enough to replicate it. The investigation was internal, Gregory Marsh had said. No police. No public record. But there was a condition. Daniel would resign, quietly. He would sign a non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from working in the industry for 3 years. He would remove himself from Olivia's life completely, without explanation, or the file would go to federal authorities, and Daniel's mother would spend her retirement visiting him in a federal corrections facility. He had sat in that chair and looked at Gregory Marsh's face and understood something very clearly. This man did not believe Daniel had stolen anything. He simply believed that Olivia was too valuable to be attached to someone like Daniel, and that an accusation was a sufficiently efficient tool for accomplishing that belief's practical outcome. Daniel was 22. He had no lawyer. He had no savings worth mentioning. His mother was 60 and had a heart condition. He had been in Olivia's life for 11 months, which was not enough time to be certain that she would choose him over her father and her family's institution and the version of herself that existed in that world. He had not been certain she would choose him. That uncertainty, more than anything, more than the threats, more than the falsified records, was what had broken him. He had signed everything they put in front of him. He had not said goodbye to Olivia. He had simply stopped existing, the way a light stops existing when someone turns off the switch completely, without gradation. He had spent the next 3 years working construction jobs in different states, eventually landing in Philadelphia, eventually working his way into a foreman position at Caldwell, eventually building the small, careful life. He now occupied the apartment, the schedule, the birthday cake from the grocery store. The brief marriage had come in year 4, when loneliness and proximity had conspired in the way they sometimes do, producing something that looked like a relationship from a distance, and revealed its structural deficiencies only up close. They had parted without particular bitterness, which was the best thing that could be said about it. Lily, who was 5 and spent weekends with him and called him Daddy, and was currently obsessed with dinosaurs, was the irreplaceable good that had come from it. He had never stopped thinking about Olivia. He had, over the years, developed an elaborate internal architecture for not thinking about Olivia, which is a different thing entirely, and is in fact just thinking about someone very intensely in the negative space. The photo in the bag, Daniel said carefully. Did your mom ever talk about who it was? Sophie shook her head. She takes it out sometimes and looks at it for a long time. Then she puts it back. She doesn't know I've seen it. A pause. She cries when she thinks I'm asleep. Daniel pressed his hands flat on the table. Sophie. He kept his voice even, gentle. Does your mom know you're talking to me right now? The girl glanced back over her shoulder at the woman in the gray coat, who had now finished her call and was turning toward their table with a phone still in hand and the mildly distracted expression of someone whose focus has just returned to a room they'd mentally left. She turned fully, and the room went hollow again. She was more composed than he was. That was the first thing he noticed, or the first thing he could notice, once his vision stopped narrowing to a single point. Olivia Marsh stood at the edge of the table with her phone held loosely at her side, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately name. Not shock. Not quite recognition. Something that preceded both of those things. Some cellular knowledge that the body registers before the mind catches up. She was 31. She had always been 8 months younger than him, and had thought this was funny. She didn't look 31, she looked like someone who had been carrying weight for a long time, and had gotten very good at carrying it. Her hair was shorter, professional cut, swept back from her face. She was wearing a gray cashmere coat over a dark dress. She was the kind of successful that came with a certain stillness, a conserved energy that people who worked very hard and slept less than they should develop over years. She looked at his face. Daniel, she said, not a question, a placement. Sophie was watching them both with the focused alertness of a child who has accidentally caused something she doesn't entirely understand. Olivia, he said. She didn't move toward him. He didn't move toward her. They stood on opposite sides of 10 years, and a small birthday cake, and a question that had no good answer. Then Sophie said, helpfully, I told him about the photo. Olivia's eyes dropped briefly to her daughter. Something crossed her face, not anger. Something softer and more complicated. She reached out and put one hand on Sophie's shoulder. Go sit down for a minute, sweetheart, she said. Take Admiral. Sophie picked up her bear from Daniel's table and retreated with the dignified reluctance of someone who is fully aware they are being managed. Olivia pulled out the chair across from Daniel and sat down in it without asking. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at him the way she used to look at problems that she hadn't decided how to approach yet. You look different, she said. So do you. You're soaked. It's raining. She looked at the cake. Is that my birthday? Yes. A pause. You're 32. You remembered. I remember everything, she said. And the steadiness in her voice made it the most quietly devastating thing anyone had said to Daniel in a decade. He looked at his hands. Olivia, why? She asked. Not angrily, not the way someone asks when they want to wound, but with a genuine, worn exhaustion. The kind of question that has been carried so long it has ceased to feel like a question and begun to feel like a wound. Why did you disappear? No call, no letter. I came to your apartment, and the super said you'd turned in the keys. You were just gone. It was complicated, he said. That's not an answer. I know. She studied him for a moment. Are you going to give me one? He thought about Gregory Marsh, the folder, the NDA he had signed 10 years ago, which he had reread twice in the years since, and had always suspected might not hold the legal weight it once seemed to. He thought about what Marcus Calloway, Olivia's current business partner, was doing right now across the city. He thought about Sophie, 8 3/4, telling him that her mother cried over a photograph. "Not tonight," he said. "Not all of it. But yes. I'll give you an answer." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." His name was Marcus Calloway. And he arrived at Crestmore 40 minutes late, wearing a suit that cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. He was 40, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of polished surface confidence that reads as charisma in rooms full of people who don't look closely. He spotted Olivia first, crossed the room with his hand already extended in greeting, and then his eyes found Daniel, and the hand dropped. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible. Daniel saw it. He had spent 10 years replaying the faces of the people in that meeting: Gregory Marsh behind his desk, the HR director taking notes, and Marcus Calloway standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, watching the whole proceeding with the careful composure of a man who has already rehearsed what comes next. Marcus Calloway, who had been a senior developer at Meridian Technologies, who had had access to every server Daniel had ever touched, who had recommended Daniel for the project that was now at the center of the falsified records. Daniel Hartwell. Marcus said it as though they were old friends, which was the most dangerous kind of lie. "It's been a long time." "It has," Daniel said. Marcus turned to Olivia with the easy pivot of someone accustomed to controlling the temperature of rooms. "I didn't know you two knew each other." "We knew each other a long time ago," Olivia said carefully. "Small world." He smiled and sat down and picked up the menu. Sophie, from her seat, was watching Marcus with the transparent distrust of children and animals, who do not yet know how to pretend not to notice things. Over the next 45 minutes, Marcus performed. It was a skilled performance, warm anecdotes, strategic name drops, the selective amnesia of a man who has decided a version of the past and committed to it so thoroughly he has almost forgotten which parts he invented. He spoke about their joint venture, a new data management firm called Calloway Marsh Partners. With proprietary pride, he asked about Daniel's work with the vague condescension of someone asking a question they've already answered for themselves. Daniel answered plainly. "Construction management. Philadelphia. 10 years. It's honest work," Marcus said, in the tone that means the opposite. "Yes," Daniel said, "it is." Sophie watched Marcus the whole time. When he laughed, she frowned. When he touched Olivia's arm to punctuate a point, Sophie's hand tightened on Admiral. Under the table, Daniel's phone buzzed. He looked at it once, quickly, a text from a number he hadn't seen in 8 years. "I heard you were back in contact with her. We need to talk. It's about Marcus." Pete Dunmore. Peter Dunmore had been a junior security analyst at Meridian Technologies when Daniel was there. He was the kind of person who exists at the edge of every office, quiet, observant, the person who fixes the printer and refills the paper trays, and knows exactly where all the bodies are buried, because he has watched everyone walk past his desk for 3 years, without ever noticing he was paying attention. They met the next morning at a diner on Locust Street, a Tuesday place with sticky menus and very good coffee. Pete looked older than Daniel remembered, heavier, with a careful beard and the specific tiredness of someone who has been holding something for a long time. He ordered coffee and held the mug in both hands and said, without preamble, "I saw Calloway plant the files." Daniel set his own mug down. "Tell me," he said. Pete told him. It had been a Thursday night, late 11:45. Pete had checked the timestamp because he was meticulous about such things. He had come back to the office for a phone charger he'd forgotten. The main floor was empty, but the server room light was on, which was unusual. And when Pete had swiped in, Marcus Calloway was at Daniel's designated workstation, logged in with his own credentials, running a script that Pete didn't understand at the time but understood very well 3 weeks later when the accusations against Daniel began. "Why didn't you say anything?" Daniel asked. Pete was quiet for a moment. "Because the next day, Marcus called me into his office and offered me a promotion and a $20,000 raise, and I was 24, and I had student loans, and I told myself I wasn't sure what I'd seen." He turned his coffee cup on the laminate tabletop. "I've been telling myself that for 10 years. There are whole months where I almost believe it, and then I see Marcus Calloway's photograph in a trade publication, and I can't eat for 3 days. What changed? He's about to do it again. Pete looked up. I still know people at the old firm. There's a new engineer at Callaway Marsh, young guy, 23. Brilliant, no family connections, no institutional safety net. I saw the pattern because I know exactly how it looked the first time. He stopped. I can't watch it happen to another person and tell myself I don't know what I'm seeing. Daniel sat with this for a moment. Outside, traffic moved through the gray morning light on Locust Street, November, doing what November does. Reminding you of everything that has contracted and gone cold. Pete, he said. I need you to be willing to say this in front of other people. Pete nodded slowly. I know, it could cost you. I know that too. That afternoon, Daniel called Olivia. She picked up on the second ring, which told him something. There's something you need to know, he said. About Marcus. About 10 years ago. About why I left. A pause on her end. Then, I've been asking myself something for 10 years, Daniel. I think I already know the shape of the answer. I just need someone to fill it in. Tonight, he said. Can we meet tonight? Yes, she said. And Daniel, bring whatever you have. It was the following Saturday. And Olivia had asked Daniel to come by in the morning so that Sophie could spend time with him before the more difficult conversations of the afternoon. He brought groceries. He wasn't sure why. It seemed like the right instinct to show up with something useful, something practical, as if he could begin repairing 10 years of absence by making breakfast. Sophie opened the door. She was wearing pajamas with small foxes on them and holding Admiral in the crook of her arm. She looked at the grocery bags. You brought eggs, she said, and orange juice, and the good bacon. We already have eggs. Then you have more eggs now. She considered this, then stepped back to let him in. They made breakfast together, which meant that Daniel cooked, and Sophie provided a continuous commentary on the correct way to fold a scrambled egg, which she had apparently learned from a cooking show that she was not technically supposed to watch, but which her mother tolerated because it was educational. She sat on the counter while he worked, Admiral watching from the windowsill, and told him about her school and her best friend Marin and a science project about cloud formation that she was fairly certain she was going to win. You sound confident about that, Daniel said. I am confident about that, Sophie said. I have evidence. He smiled at the pan. She ate her eggs at the kitchen island with the focused seriousness of someone refueling, and then she looked up at him with that particular directness. She had the quality of asking questions she had already been thinking about for some time. Did you ever think about me? She asked. The kitchen went still. Daniel set down his fork. He had not known about Sophie until 3 days ago, when Olivia had told him quietly, carefully, watching his face, that she had found out she was pregnant 6 weeks after he disappeared, that she had tried every channel she could think of to find him, that she had eventually concluded he had chosen to go and had chosen not to be found, and that she had made peace with that, partially, imperfectly, the way you make peace with a wound that never fully closes. He had not slept since she told him. No, he said. I didn't think about you. Sophie's expression didn't change. Because I didn't know you existed, he said. And that is the thing I am going to spend a very long time wishing I could change. The girl studied him with those old soul eyes. That's not the same as not wanting me, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked back at her eggs. Okay, she said, as if something had been resolved. Outside, traffic moved through the Saturday morning. Daniel sat at the counter across from his daughter, who had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and a name he hadn't known to give her. And he let himself feel all of it, the grief of the years gone, the impossible gratitude of the years remaining. When Olivia came downstairs 20 minutes later, she found them doing the dishes together, Sophie explaining the correct technique for drying wine glasses, which she had also learned from television. Olivia stood in the kitchen doorway and watched this for a moment. Her expression was something Daniel didn't have a word for. He wasn't sure there was a word for it. His name was Franklin Reeves, and he arrived in a car that cost more than most apartments. He was 63, with the lean self-possession of a man who has been rich long enough that money has become invisible to him, the way water is invisible to fish. He was the chairman of Apex Data Systems, Meridian's largest competitor, and, since the Callaway Marsh venture had been announced, its most interested adversary. He had requested the meeting through a contact that Daniel hadn't spoken to in 8 years, and he had suggested a hotel lobby with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to meetings going where he wanted them to go. He ordered mineral water. He placed a business card on the table. "I've been watching your career," he said to Daniel, or rather, "I've been watching the absence of it, and trying to understand why someone with your particular abilities spent a decade pouring concrete." "Managing the teams that pour concrete," Daniel said. "There's a difference." Reeves allowed this. "I knew what you built at Meridian before the situation with Marsh. I knew the architecture. I've seen 3 other engineers try to replicate aspects of it in the years since, and none of them have managed it cleanly." He folded his hands on the table. "I want you to come work with Apex. I want you to build what you were building. Better. Bigger. With the resources you didn't have at 22. And the $10 million, Daniel said. Signing incentive. Retention package across the first 3 years. Standard for someone of your demonstrated capability, if not your current employment history." He said this without inflection, which made it more rather than less pointed. "I understand there's also a situation with Callaway that's coming to a head. We would, of course, be supportive of any legal or investigative processes that might arise from that." Daniel looked at the business card on the table. It was thick stock, embossed. "I need time to think about this," he said. "You have 72 hours, Reeves said, with the brisk pleasantness of a man who considers 72 hours extremely generous. That evening, Daniel told Olivia about the offer. They were sitting at her kitchen table after Sophie had gone to bed, 2 mugs of tea between them. The conversation finally passed the careful early stages, where both of them had been watching their footing. "Take it," she said immediately. "It's not simple. It's exactly as simple as it sounds. You're brilliant, Daniel. You've been wasting yourself for 10 years, because my father decided your talent was a threat to his control." She looked at her mug. "Take the job. Take the money. Use it." "For what?" She looked up at him. "For whatever you want. For Sophie. For yourself. You've earned something back." She paused. "We've both earned something back." He was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen ceiling came the faint sound of Sophie moving. She was a restless sleeper. "Like him. If I take the job," he said carefully, "it doesn't fix what I missed." "No," Olivia said. "It doesn't. But it gives you something to build going forward. And building is what you do." He looked at her. In the kitchen light, she looked the way he had kept her in his memory for 10 years, except more real, more tired, and more particular, and more undeniably herself. "I missed you," he said. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I missed you too. Every single day. Which is a complete waste of a decade. And I'm very angry about it." He almost smiled. "I know. Marcus is going to fight back," she said. "When this comes out, and it has to come out, he's not going to go quietly. I know that too." She turned her mug in her hands. "I'm not going to step back from this, Daniel. I want you to understand that. Whatever comes, I'm not going to step back." He nodded slowly. "Neither am I," he said. "Not anymore." Marcus moved faster than Daniel had expected. By Wednesday morning, a story had appeared in 2 financial news outlets, the kind with aggressive websites and anonymous source policies, claiming that Daniel Hartwell, a former Meridian Technologies employee who had departed under a cloud of internal investigation, was attempting to leverage a personal relationship with Olivia Marsh to interfere with the Callaway Marsh business venture. The story named him. It used the phrase "forced to resign" 3 times. It quoted a source close to the partnership who described Daniel as someone with a grudge and a grievance, and very little else. The story was thin on verifiable facts and heavy on implication. But implication is the most durable architecture of damage. It doesn't require structural proof, because it is built to outlast any specific rebuttal. By the time a rebuttal arrives, The shape of the story has already settled into the minds of people who will half remember it at exactly the wrong moment. By Wednesday afternoon, Franklin Reeves's office had called to say that the offer remained on the table, but that the board wanted to understand the situation more fully before proceeding. The tone of the call was professionally neutral, in the way that professional neutrality is itself a kind of assessment. By Wednesday evening, Marcus had called Olivia directly. She told Daniel about it the next morning, standing in her kitchen with her arms crossed and an expression of cold fury that he had always recognized as the thing that came before the thing where she made decisions. When Olivia Marsh was warmly, expressively angry, she was processing. When she went still and precise, and her voice dropped to its most deliberate register, she had already decided. He said he was calling to check in, she said. Out of concern. He said he'd heard that someone from my past had resurfaced, and that he wanted to make sure I wasn't being taken advantage of. She paused. He used the phrase, taken advantage, of 4 separate times. I counted. What did you say? I said thank you for the concern, and that I'd speak to my lawyers about the media coverage. She uncrossed her arms. And then I hung up and called my lawyers. There was also the matter of Sophie. On Thursday morning, Sophie's school called. A man later confirmed to have been sent by someone in Marcus's network had appeared at the school's front office, claiming to be a family friend and asking for Sophie's class schedule in case of an emergency. The school, correctly, had declined to provide any information and had called Olivia immediately. When Daniel heard about the school visit, he went very quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone suppressing anger, the quieter quiet of someone arriving at a place inside themselves. He thought about a leather chair in Gregory Marsh's office, about a folder of fabricated evidence, about being 22 and alone and deciding that retreat was the only protection he could offer the people he loved. He had been wrong then. Not about the threat had been real. He had been wrong about retreat, about what it cost, about whether the people he was trying to protect were better served by his absence or his presence. He called Pete Dunmore. I need you ready, he said. The shareholders' meeting is Friday. I know, Pete said. He sounded frightened and decided in equal measure, which Daniel recognized as the specific emotional temperature of someone who has found the thing they will not back away from. I'll be there, Pete said. Then Daniel called Franklin Reeves. The situation you asked about, Daniel said. It's going to resolve itself publicly on Friday morning. I'd recommend having someone present. What kind of resolution? Reeves asked. The kind that removes ambiguity, Daniel said. The Callaway Marsh Partners annual review was held in the conference facilities of the Whitmore building on Chestnut Street. On the 42nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city, and the kind of catered breakfast that exists to make people feel they've already been rewarded before anything has been decided. There were approximately 60 people in the room, shareholders, board members, partners, legal counsel. Olivia was already there when Daniel arrived, standing near the far wall in a dark suit, composed in the way of someone who has rehearsed composure under pressure. Marcus was at the front of the room, talking to 2 board members, completely at ease. He saw Daniel come in, and his expression didn't change. He was too practiced for that. The session began at 9:15. Marcus presented Q3 results. He was very good at this, clear, confident, with the kind of selective data presentation that tells a story so smoothly that the gaps are invisible unless you already know where to look. Daniel sat in the second row and listened and watched the room's posture settle into receptive agreement. When Marcus opened the floor for questions at 9:50, Daniel raised his hand. Marcus's eyes found him. A pause, a fraction of a second, invisible to everyone else. Go ahead, Marcus said. Daniel stood. He spoke for 11 minutes. He was calm and precise, and used the language of the room: financial risk, data integrity, governance obligations. He presented the timeline he had constructed from Pete's testimony, cross-referenced with access logs that Pete had retained copies of, and that had sat in an encrypted file on Pete's home computer for 10 years. He presented 3 other pieces of corroborating documentation that Olivia's legal team had obtained in 48 hours of intensive work. At minute 6, Marcus attempted to interrupt. At minute 7, the board chair, a woman named Sandra Whitfield, who had 25 years of corporate governance experience, and the specific impatience of someone who has heard every variety of lie, held up one hand and said, "Let him finish." At minute 9, Pete Dunmore stood up from his seat at the back of the room. He spoke for 4 minutes. His voice shook slightly. He didn't stop. The room was very quiet. Marcus said, "This is a manufactured attack from a competitor with a financial interest in undermining Mr. Calloway." Sandra Whitfield's voice was quiet and final. "Please sit down." At 10:14, Olivia spoke. She said that she had spent the last 48 hours reviewing the documentation with her legal team, and that she had also spoken directly to 2 former Meridian executives who had confirmed, independently of Pete's testimony, that the internal investigation that resulted in Daniel Hartwell's forced departure had been irregular in its process and outcome. She said that she was requesting an immediate independent review of the Calloway-Marsh partnership structure. She said that she was also formally withdrawing her support for Marcus Calloway's continued role as a managing partner. She said all of this in the measured, deliberate tone of a person who has made a decision and will not be unmade. Marcus stood up. His composure was still in place, but it was the composure of scaffolding, structural, visible, holding something up that could no longer hold itself. "Olivia, don't," she said. "Just that. Don't." He sat back down. At 10:41, 2 members of Sandra Whitfield's compliance team escorted Marcus Calloway from the building. At 10:43, Daniel became aware that Sophie was standing at the conference room door. Olivia had brought her head and intended to let her in, but Sophie had apparently taken the situation into her own hands in the way that she took most situations. She was holding Admiral against her chest and looking at Daniel across the room with her serious brown eyes. He crossed the room. He crouched down so he was at her level. "You came back," she said. "I came back," he said. She pressed Admiral into his hands. She had apparently decided he needed the bear more than she did. 3 months later, on a Saturday in November, the party was Daniel's idea. Not a birthday party, not exactly. Just a gathering, small and intentional, in the backyard of Olivia's house, where strings of lights had been strung between the oak trees, and Sophie had spent the previous afternoon arranging chairs with the organizational intensity of someone who had very specific ideas about sight lines and seating, proximity. She had also made a seating chart, drawn in colored pencil on a piece of cardstock, which she presented to both adults separately and with the stern instruction that they were not allowed to compare versions. They compared versions later, in the kitchen, while Sophie was occupied with Admiral. The seating charts were identical, and placed Daniel and Olivia side by side at every possible juncture. "She's not subtle," Olivia said. "She's 8, Daniel said. "She's not supposed to be subtle. She's supposed to be exactly what she is." Pete Dunmore came with his wife, a quiet woman named Claire, who shook Daniel's hand with both of hers and said, "Pete told me what he did, and what he should have done years ago. I'm glad he finally did the right thing." It was the most compressed moral accounting Daniel had ever witnessed, and Pete received it with the slightly diminished posture of a man being accurately evaluated. Franklin Reeves sent flowers and a very good bottle of wine and a handwritten note in the clipped, declarative style of someone who has been composing correspondence for 40 years. "We look forward to your first week in January. The people who needed to know about Friday now know. Well done." Olivia's mother came and spent 20 minutes talking to Daniel with the careful, probing courtesy of a woman conducting an assessment she intends to complete. She asked him about his work, about his daughter Lily, about how he took his coffee. At the end of those 20 minutes, she put one hand briefly on his arm and said, "You have a great deal of ground to make up." He said, "I know." She said, "Good," and moved on to the cheese plate, apparently satisfied. The Apex signing bonus, the $10 million that had seemed almost abstract when Franklin Reeves first named it, was not going into any account to accumulate. Daniel had spent the week since the signing working with financial advisors and a non-profit attorney named Clara Beckett, who wore reading glasses on a chain and asked questions that were 3 steps ahead of the conversation. Together, they had built out the structure of the Hartwell Foundation. Scholarship funds for first-generation engineering students at schools with no endowments, a mentorship program pairing young professionals in technology with engineers who had navigated their careers without institutional networks, a grant structure for community technical education programs in cities like the ones Daniel had drifted through in his 20s, earning his living with his hands and his back, while the part of his mind that built systems sat quietly in storage. Olivia had reviewed the full proposal over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, asking questions that were sharp and precise and occasionally inconvenient. At the end of the second evening, she set down the documents and looked at him. "This is going to take everything," she said. "Most of it," he agreed. "For the first few years, you're comfortable with that?" "Yes." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because the money was never, it was always a symbol of something, a restoration. And I don't want a symbol. I want something real. This is real." He paused. "And I have other things now. Things that matter more than a restored symbol." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "That," she said, "is the most like yourself you've sounded since you came back." Sophie had designated herself the Foundation's Junior Advisory Board, a title she had created independently and which she considered fully official. She had already submitted 3 suggestions in writing, in the careful printing of someone who understands the power of documentation. One suggestion concerned the importance of science curriculum for girls in elementary school. One concerned the availability of quality stuffed animals in hospital waiting rooms. One was a diagram of what she described as a better way to organize information, which Daniel had spent 20 minutes studying and suspected might actually be a workable filing system architecture. He was going to be a good father. He knew this the way he knew how to read a blueprint, not with certainty that nothing would go wrong, but with the trained conviction that he understood the structure and could work within it, and that the work was worth doing precisely because the result mattered. She was at Daniel's side for most of the party, narrating the proceedings to Admiral with the authoritative commentary of a documentary filmmaker, pointing out who was talking to whom and what it probably meant. She had a gift for social observation that was either going to make her an extraordinary leader or an extremely alarming dinner party guest, depending on the context and the guests. At one point, she told Daniel, with the clinical confidence of a field researcher, that Pete Dunmore's wife had now introduced herself to 3 separate people and described Pete as very brave, which Sophie assessed as probably good for Pete but maybe a little much. "You might be right," Daniel said. "I'm usually right," Sophie said, without particular arrogance, the way you state a thing you have tested methodically and confirmed through repeated evidence. At one point, when the evening had softened and most of the guests had drifted into comfortable clusters, and the light from the oak trees had turned the yard into something that felt constructed, cinematic, impossible and actual at once, Sophie tugged Daniel's hand and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Always," he said. "Are you going to stay?" He looked at her, the bear she had given back to him, tucked under his arm. The string lights in the trees. Olivia across the yard, talking to Pete's wife, laughing at something, glancing over once and catching his eye in the way she had been doing all evening, as if to confirm he was still there. "Yes," he said. Even when it's hard, he considered this the way she deserved it to be considered as a real question. Asked by someone who understood that answers have weight. "Especially then," he said. She seemed satisfied with this. She took Admiral back, apparently having decided that the crisis requiring his loan had passed. Later, after Sophie had been persuaded to go to bed with the diplomatic intensity of a UN negotiation, Daniel and Olivia sat on the back step with mugs of tea going cold between them, and the yard had gone quiet except for the occasional tick of the lights and the distant sound of the city. "I keep thinking," Olivia said, "about all the things that had to go wrong for us to be sitting here." "Me too. That's a strange thing to be grateful for." "I'm not sure grateful is the right word," he said. "I think it's more like I understand it now. Why it had to be exactly as broken as it was to end up here." She was quiet for a moment. "I spent a long time being angry at you," she said. "I want you to know that. Even after I understood why you did it." "That's fair." "It is, yes." She turned her mug in her hands. "I also spent a long time hoping you were okay, wherever you were." even when I was angry. Both things were true at the same time. That's the most you thing I've ever heard. She laughed a real laugh. Not the composed professional one she had at the restaurant, but the one he had kept in some internal storage space for a decade. The one that was slightly surprised at itself. I have a daughter, he said. It still arrived in him like something new each time. I have a daughter who has a bear named Admiral and strong opinions about cloud formation, and she made a seating chart tonight that I'm fairly sure was designed to keep me adjacent to you all evening. She did, Olivia confirmed. I checked. She's extraordinary. She is. A pause. She gets it from both of us, I think. He looked out at the lit yard, at the shapes of the oak trees, at the particular quality of a night that has gone exactly right. I wasted 10 years, he said. We did, she said, both of us. I know. But He stopped. Started again. I don't want to waste what's in front of me now. Any of it. I want to be very deliberate about not wasting it. Olivia turned to look at him. In the light from the doorway behind them, she looked exactly herself, tired and specific and decided. The woman he had loved at 22 and recognized at 32 and was still, irreducibly, in love with, now. Then don't, she said. He nodded. The tea went cold. The lights ticked softly in the oak branches. Somewhere upstairs, Sophie was not sleeping. Because Sophie rarely slept on event nights, and was probably narrating the entire day to Admiral, in the careful, comprehensive way she narrated things she wanted to remember. Daniel Hartwell sat on the back step of a house that was becoming familiar, with a woman he had never stopped loving, in a life that had been broken in ways that had taken 10 years to understand, and that now, imperfectly and completely, and not at all from the top of a plan, was being rebuilt. The most valuable things he had ever had were not in his bank account. They were upstairs, telling a stuffed bear about cloud formations. They were beside him, finally, holding a cup of cold tea. They were in his chest, settling into the right place after a very long time away. Sometimes life breaks your heart just to return it to the right people. He had not believed that when he was 22. He believed it now wholly, finally, with everything he had left. He had the evidence to prove it.